All right, you guys, so today we are looking at learning target 4.2.1. This is the first learning target for PS4 or Unit 4. Our I can statement for today says I can identify key characteristics and vocab in polynomial expressions. Now you may say, hey, there's a couple words in there that I don't recognize. Polynomial is the big one. That is what we are mainly focusing on today. We're going to look at a lot of vocab. Now, as we go along here, remember that I did send out a copy of these notes, so ideally you have printed those off and can follow along with me. However, if you did not print those out, you still need to grab a separate sheet of paper and write down any of the important things that we cover today. Remember that this will only benefit you in the long run, as you can use notes on all of your homework and assessments. So this is only something that will help you. All right, now before we get started, we're going to go over some review vocab. So that purple box right there, this is all stuff that we have learned previously. Specifically, we went over it in PS1 or Unit 1 way back in the beginning of the year. So all of these terms should look familiar. However, I think all of us could use a quick recap. All right, the first word that we're looking at is variable, and this is any letter. So any letter that represents a number, it's usually following a coefficient. So if you look over to the left-hand side here, there is this expression that says negative 6x plus 2. In that expression, we have one variable, and our variable here would be x. That's our letter. All right, our next vocab or recap vocab is coefficient, a number multiplied to a variable or the number next to the variable. So in this case, negative 6 would be our coefficient. It is being multiplied to x. All right, our third review vocab is constant. This is any number all by itself, and there is no variable next to it. So in our example over to the left, plus 2 or positive 2 is our constant. And then lastly, one of the big confusing vocab words for a lot of students is this word term. This is something that is added or subtracted to another part of an expression. So again, if we look back at that left-hand side, we actually have two terms here. We have negative 6x and positive 2. Those are both terms. They are separated by a plus sign. All right, and then our very last review vocab is expression. There were two main things in Algebra 1, equations and expressions. Equations we worked on a lot first semester. Expressions we're working on a lot second semester. In an expression, you simplify, and in an equation, you solve. So today we are just really going to be simplifying. All right, so on to our new vocabulary. Our first new vocabulary word is polynomial, and this was the word that we saw in our I can statement. This is an expression with one or more terms. That prefix poly means many, so it just means many terms. So over on this right-hand side, that is an example of a polynomial. And specifically, this polynomial has 1, 2, 3 terms. All right, now before we get on to our next couple vocabs, we want to point out a few parts of a term. So this first thing we already talked about, a coefficient, that's our number in front. We have two other words that we didn't see before though. This is exponent. That's just our little number. A lot of times people get coefficients and exponents confused. Remember, exponent is that little number up top, and then the base is the variable right next to that exponent. All right, now there are two ways to classify a polynomial. You can classify a polynomial by the number of terms, so how many things are separated by a plus or a minus, and by the degree. Now the degree, this is a new one. We hadn't seen this vocab word yet. This is the highest or the largest exponent. So you're going to look for that little number and try and find the largest little number. And I'll show you what I mean in a couple examples here. So in our examples, we're going to look at these expressions and we want to pick out two things. We want to pick out the number of terms and the degree. So let's start with an easy one. Let's start with that first example. 4x squared. Well, there are no pluses or minuses. There is only one term in this example. And there are no highest exponents because there's only one exponent to choose from. So our degree here would be 2. All right, let's make it a little bit trickier on ourselves. Let's try that second example. Here we're looking, again, number of terms is how many things are separated by a plus or a minus. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 things separated by a plus or a minus, 4 terms. And then our highest exponent, in this case, would also be 4. All right, let's go on to that next example. Here we have 1, 2, 3 terms. And our highest exponent here would be 5. So we have a degree of 5. All right, this next one's a little bit weird. Now we have 1, 2 things separated by a plus, or 2 terms. And if you look at all the other examples, these first 3 examples, the degree was always the first exponent. However, in this fourth example, that's not the case. In this fourth example, we see that our highest exponent is actually shown at the very end of this expression. And so our degree here would be 3. So it doesn't matter which order these terms are written in, you're just looking for the largest exponent. All right, very last example. Here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 terms. And our highest exponent here would be an 8. So we have a degree of 8. And that is the first big part of learning target 4.2.1. However, there is a little bit more. So we're going to continue on to that next page. Here we go. All right, as you can see, we have a brand new vocabulary word. This is just another way to characterize a polynomial. It is leading coefficient. And a leading coefficient is the coefficient, or the number in front, of the term with the highest exponent. Or as we now know, these highest exponent, that's the degree. So we're looking for the number in front of the term that has the degree of the polynomial. So let's look at this first example. They want us to circle the leading coefficient. All right, so the first thing you're going to want to do is look for the highest exponent. That's going to help us first find our leading coefficient. Our highest exponent in this case is 5. So then what we have to do, remember, I don't want the degree, I want the coefficient of this term. And our coefficient of this term would be 8. So I'm just going to say our leading coefficient, LC, equals 8. All right, let's try one more. In example 2, again, we're trying to circle the leading coefficient. So we're going to look for the highest exponent, our degree. And then the number in front of that term here is 4. So our leading coefficient, LC, equals 4. That next part says, what must you remember when finding the leading coefficient? This is a common mistake that I see a lot of students make, is that they automatically just they just write down the first number as the leading coefficient. We want to remember that it's not always the first number. As you can see in example 2, there we're actually looking at the second term. All right, our last big thing for polynomials, this is what we call standard form. And standard form is the proper way of writing polynomials with the highest degree first. So essentially what we're doing is we're writing these polynomials, we're reordering them from biggest to smallest. And now the way that we do this is we go by the exponents. You do not go by the numbers in front. You go by those tiny little numbers next to the variables. So looking at our two options in example 1, we want to circle the trinomial. Trinomial just means a polynomial with 3 terms. We want to circle the polynomial that is in standard form. So let's look at our options here. In A, again, we're paying attention to these exponents. So in A, we have an exponent of 4, and then followed by an exponent of 2. And then this one doesn't have an exponent. There's a little invisible one, 0. Because there isn't even a variable here. Now in B, we have our exponent of 2, followed by, this time, since there is a variable, there's an invisible exponent of 1, and then an exponent of 3. Now looking between those two options, we want to know which one is in descending order or written from biggest to smallest, which means it has to be A because we go from 4 to 2 to 0. And then in B, it was 2, then 1, then 3, which is not in order. So A is the polynomial written in standard form. All right, now let's try and do it ourselves. In example 2, we want to rewrite these polynomials in standard form. So we're going to look for the term with the highest exponent first. Well, in this case, our highest exponent is 5. So we're going to write that entire term as the first term in standard form. Now remember to include our signs in front of those coefficients. So I'm going to write negative 6x to the 5th. Our next biggest term would be this term with an exponent of 4. So I'd write negative 2x to the 4th. Again, I included that sign in front. Followed by our exponent of 3. You can see I'm going from biggest to smallest. This time there's a plus in front of that term. And then here's where people tend to get a little bit confused. Anything with an x will come before a constant. So we're going to go 7x, then our constant at the very end. And that right there is standard form. Yay! All right, let's try this next one. This next one, we are looking for our highest degree or our highest exponent. Well, here we can see 4 is our highest exponent, but we actually have 2 terms with an exponent of 4. So we're going to do something we know and love. We are going to combine like terms. We have an x to the 4th and a 3x to the 4th. Remember, this x to the 4th really has an invisible 1 in front. So when we add 1x to the 4th and 3x to the 4th, we're going to have 4x to the 4th. Our next biggest exponent would have a 3. So I'm going to write plus 10x to the 3rd, followed by this minus 5x. And then remember, our constant always goes at the end. And again, we're paying special attention to those signs in front. All right, now let's put it all together. So this is something you would typically see on an assessment. We're going to give you a polynomial, and you're going to have to pick out a bunch of its characteristics. Now, don't worry about this name part. That's a little bit outdated. Let's first rewrite this in standard form. So looking at my expression, we're going from biggest to smallest, and remember, we don't care about the numbers in front. Even we're only looking at the exponents. So our biggest exponent is 5. So I'm going to write 9x to the 5th. We write that entire term. Now, even though 8 would technically be the next biggest number, remember, we don't care about those big numbers. We only care about the exponents. So our next term then will be this one with the exponent of 3, negative 2x to the 3rd. Followed by negative 6x. And at the very end, our constant, 8. Remember, constant is just the number without a variable. All right, our leading coefficient, we look at the term with the biggest exponent, our degree, and then we look at the number in front, the coefficient of that term. So 9x to the 5th, that's the term we're looking at since 5 is the biggest exponent. But I'm not going to write that whole term. If you write 9x to the 5th, I will not be able to give you credit for that. Instead, we're just going to write the number in front here, which is 9. All right, number of terms, let's count them. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 things separated by a plus or a minus. And then our degree is the highest exponent. So here, our highest exponent, 5. And you're done. Yay! All right, so those are all of our characteristics of polynomials. Remember that you should have written these down. You will be able to use this on homework and assessments. If you are struggling, please attend tutoring or reach out to your teachers by an email. I hope that cleared up any of your confusion with characteristics of polynomials. At this point, you should be moving on to work on your practice for 4.2.1. So good luck on your assignment.